Time now for public comment. That's the time during our meeting when we allow people from the community to present issues to the fiscal court. Sometimes, if there's anybody here who would like to address the fiscal court at this point, I'd ask you to come forward individually and please state your name and address.
My name is Larry Kaiser, 3000 Maple Leaf Drive. I'm here today. I reached out to you guys via email and telephone on February 26th about legalizing or sending a resolution to Frankfurt in support of medical cannabis. I encourage you guys to take that on the floor today and put it up for a vote. The session in Frankfurt ends in the first part of April, so time is of the essence. And I'd like to give my remaining couple minutes to Mr. Jaime Montalvo, who can speak more about the bill for those who may have missed the town hall. Thank you.
Please state your name and address as well.
Yes, sir. Thank you, council members, for allowing me to speak today. My name is Jaime Montalvo. I'm a resident of Jefferson County and was invited here by a few constituents in your district. I helped draft House Bill 166, and I am a multiple sclerosis patient that's been lobbying for the passing of a medical cannabis bill in Frankfurt for the last 6 years. We have here a one-pager about, we have a should I name it?
Go ahead.
Okay. We have a one-pager here of our 85-page bill, which has been, it basically, how do you focus? Okay, I'm sorry. So this one-pager breaks down the 85-page bill to the most important parts. Basically, the state would have a department which would regulate everything under the Public Protection Cabinet. That department would first focus in on public safety. They would have to administrate the regulations. They would have to approve or deny patients or licenses. This is a local opt-in program. Just because Frankfurt passes House Bill 166, it does not legalize medical cannabis in your area here in Oldham County. If passed, House Bill 166 would allow the localities to vote on bringing the licenses here to your area. With the opting in, that would bring in a revenue sharing program which would allow Oldham County to hire new drug recognition experts or new enforcement officers, so that's more jobs for our local police. That revenue sharing program would also create 3% revenue for new grants to look into people driving under the influence of marijuana. We want to keep our streets safe for citizens driving. So patients, again, this wouldn't be legalizing for everyone. This would be for qualifying conditions and people who have a qualifying condition practitioner. That practitioner has to take a course that's approved through the state, so it's a continuing medical education course. And they have to be approved through the Department of Medical Cannabis. They have to then abide, if they do get approved, they have to abide by the rules and regulations. Those rules and regulations are such as no public smoking, no public consumption. Driving under the influence would be still illegal. So again, to curb that, we hire new drug recognition experts. There's no advertising of any sort. We don't want billboards, radio, TV advertising, so we can keep it away from our children. It's not commercializing it. There is a Casper-like program that keeps up with patients who consume it and have access to it. Law enforcement would have a 24/7 access to this program to see who is approved and who is not. There is a card for any patient that is approved. It has a number. Law enforcement can look up that number at any point in time to see if somebody is a legal patient. There is product inventory control with these businesses that are approved through the state, so we don't have diversion into the black market. We, again, want to keep our public safe, but also giving safe access to patients who really need it, patients who are really sick, such as multiple sclerosis or cancer or post-traumatic stress with veterans. Any product that's being sold at these facilities needs to be quality control tested. We want the products to be sold in a child-proof container that is opaque so our children do not see it. Any product that's being oral consumption has to be no more than 10 milligrams. It has to be stamped with the state-approved seal so that everyone knows that that product has cannabis in it. Again, we want to keep it away from our children. That's about it on that one pager there. I do have, some of the members were present in the Justice and Public Safety meeting prior to. We shared this one sheet here, which is a one-pager about the health benefits of cannabis. Again, I'm a multiple sclerosis patient. I found it to be effective in the treatment of my condition. They studied the 24,000 studies done on cannabis, narrowed it down to 10,000. From those 10,000, they made 100 conclusions, 3 of them solid with no refuting evidence. It was helpful for chronic pain, it was helpful for nausea and vomiting, and it was helpful for muscle spasms attributed to multiple sclerosis like I have. This is one last thing that I'm going to share with you. It's kind of hard to see that one there. Scoot it over here. There we go. Okay, so this is a study that was done on states with medical cannabis, and they found a reduction in opioid prescribing patterns for physicians. There was actually a reduction of 11% of prescriptions given by physicians to patients in those states from 96 to 2013. That's 11%, which means 1,800 prescribing units per physician per year. That could potentially save, say, 25% of the patients who are dying every year of opioids, because that was another study that was done and published in the Journal of American Medical Association. 24.8% reduction in overdoses in states with medical cannabis access. So I've got plenty of information. We don't have enough time. I'd love to answer or entertain any questions if you guys did have some. And I would love to request that you would pass a resolution in support of medical cannabis. It doesn't necessarily have to be for House Bill 166, but just for patients having safe access to cannabis without fear of prosecution, incarceration, and arrest. That's what we're requesting.
All right, does anyone have any questions they would like to ask here regarding this?
Thank you, members.
Hang on, Mr. Eldridge?
Thank you. I've been to 2 recent forums on this subject, and I'll have to say that you've been more informative here in 4 minutes than what I've heard in hours at the other 2 forums.
Thank you.
One of the questions that has continually come up and that I've gotten emails on is, for example, Mr. Greenwell, who drives a bus, I have employees that are DOT licensed. Anytime you have an accident, you immediately go and have a urine test.
Right.
When you have that urine test, they say, okay, 0.08 is drunk, you've had too much alcohol. If you have 0.01, that means that you may have had a beer last night, but it doesn't affect you today. It's the understanding that I'm hearing from people, and also that I heard when I went to the Oldham County forum, that they really don't have a way to test for that right now under marijuana. Is that correct?
There's not a specific test that will check to see how far you are under the influence of marijuana. But what we do here in Kentucky today to test for cannabis or marijuana in your system is they do a field sobriety test. So if you were driving on our streets here today and you were swerving, law enforcement would stop you. They'd do a breath analyzer test. You'd show up negative for alcohol. Then they'd do a field sobriety test. So they'd make you walk on a straight line, lift your leg up, put your hand to your finger to your nose. And from those tests, they see if you are under the influence. And if you fail, you're under the influence of something. They don't know exactly what it is, but you're under the influence. And what we're doing in our legislation is we're increasing the funding so we have more experts on the road that know how to do those tests.
That wasn't really my question, and I didn't make it clear enough, so let me do that. Help me out here, Mr. Greenwell. When they test you, you're allowed to have, what is the amount of alcohol in your system?
0.08. Not for a bus driver.
Exactly. For a bus driver, it's
0.04.
0.04. In other words, this is next day. This isn't you were just in a fender bender or you took the random draw and you have to go get a test. So you're allowed, in his case, in alcohol to have 0.04. But it's my understanding they don't have any way to classify how much marijuana you can have.
That's correct.
Okay.
There is no way. But as using that DOT license today, for an example, say somebody was stopped for an accident, something like that, they may test positive for cannabis, and that they can't necessarily say that that person was under the influence of cannabis, and that's what caused the accident. But they can say, if they did the field sobriety test, that that person was under the influence. So they can still be charged, but not necessarily because they were over, say, 0.08% cannabis. There's no such test. Actually, I can go into a little bit more detail in how states have done those. For instance, in Colorado and Montana, they had a 0.05% level for cannabis, and they found actually that driving under the influence charges went up, but people were not impaired, and the law wasn't allowing them to catch people who were actually driving impaired, who were novice people sliding under that 0.5% level. So there's the research. What we did do in our legislation, though, to help curb that, is we took 3% of the revenue from the licenses and the taxing, and we made it into a grant program so that researchers can then start studying how best to test for somebody driving under the influence. So maybe we could create a breath analyzer or an iris test that would check for driving under the influence of marijuana.
Thank you.
Mr. Carter.
Yeah, I have a question.
Yes, sir.
We already have medical marijuana in Kentucky.
What is that?
It can be prescribed as synthetic marijuana. It can be prescribed by pills. The Cabinet for Health Cabinet for Health and Family Services, in their rules and regulations, have approved that, and you can actually get a prescription for it.
I believe you're maybe referring to Marinol and Sesamet, which
That's
are
right.
prescription drugs.
Yes.
They were approved in 1985 for chemotherapy, nausea and vomiting from chemotherapy. In Kentucky, most physicians do not prescribe that. I went through chemotherapy myself, and both of my physicians refused to give me that just because it's not first line of defense. There are other medications that are more effective than the Marinol at treating the nausea and the vomiting. Most insurance companies do not cover it. It's about $1,500 a month to $2,000 a month. Out of pocket, it's about $200 a month. Most patients won't use it. It does not seem to help their nausea and vomiting. What some physicians do today, though, is they give a prescription for Marinol for a patient like myself going through chemotherapy or such, so that then they have the excuse to test positive if they are then tested by another physician. It's basically, it allows you to test positive. It's a mask. So there are some physicians that are very caring in that respect.
Would you like to give us the definition of practitioner, please?
Yes, a practitioner, and the definition in our bill is a physician or a nurse practitioner. So they are allowed to prescribe. Now with cannabis, they have to give you that certification on a state-approved form. And they basically, what they're doing is they're certifying that that patient is suffering from one of the qualifying conditions, which can be, say, chronic pain, multiple sclerosis, Alzheimer's, movement disorder. There's various conditions. We do have a handout for that if the committee wanted it. But you do have to have a qualifying condition that is identified by that practitioner or that physician.
All right. And as I understand it, the physician issues a qualifying letter or certification to the patient, not a prescription as such.
Right. On a state-approved form, that certification has to be written. That certification then is taken by that patient to the State Department that regulates everything. That State Department then has the power to approve or deny that patient. You can get denied for, say, a violent felony offense, you have a violent criminal history, you lied on your documents, your physician isn't really your physician. There's various reasons why you could be denied, but the state has ultimate control of who gets approved and who does not.
This bill calls for dispensaries.
Yes, sir.
Most of us use the term pharmacy or drugstore, but they're not synonymous with dispensary. Is that correct?
Correct. Pharmacy owners or pharmacists are regulated by the federal government. They're not allowed to dispense cannabis. Some states have tried to use pharmacies to dispense it, and it hasn't functioned. And it actually took them 2 or 3 years to modify the law to you know, they have pharmacists on the boards and such, but we did not require the pharmacists to be part of the board or the dispensing because we found out that it just doesn't function. What we did ask for is the state to have ultimate control of who the businesses are that are operating in these programs and who the patients are. So the state has ultimate control.
This morning, I received a call from a legislator who wanted to apprise me of some changes that had been made in the House Bill 166, and the changes include no self-growing by patients, can't grow their own, no use in public. The bill that now, where it didn't before, permits collaboration between federal, state, and local authorities in regard to enforcement. A certain portion of the tax revenue would be directed toward the pension plan, and the number of qualifying conditions had been reduced significantly, I was told. And if it were passed by the legislature, the bill would require each county to grant permission for use within the county. Okay, would that be use as a grower, use as a patient, use as a dispensary, use as a producer? There are several different steps in the chain of how some form, and I understand you might address the number of ways in which the cannabis plant is dispensed. But if you get permission in a county, is it for everything, nothing, one step, two steps, what?
That's a very good question. The option to opt in is for the commercial businesses. So basically the cultivator, the producer, the processor, the safety facility, the businesses that are going to be growing it, processing it, making it into a product, and actually selling it to that qualifying patient. That is what is opt-in. The law itself, if, say, for instance, House Bill 166, if it was passed today, it would allow that qualifying patient to possess it and to consume it. But it doesn't automatically legalize the sale in your locality. That is what you are voting on later, once, if and when the bill gets passed.
Right. Does anyone have a question they'd like to ask in addition to this? Okay, thank you.
Thank you, members.
Wingham paving, $308,532.56.
252, 205, 63.
Global paving was 200, support House Bill 166. We haven't had this very long. Our custom here is not to take requests immediately and jump into them. I'll say this. Is there any objection here to me writing a letter to the appropriate committee saying that we have received this presentation and are concerned about the suffering, pain, and health impacts that are experienced by a number of people in the state that proponents of medical marijuana claim may alleviate that pain, and that we encourage the legislature to look into the issue further and come to an understanding that would be appropriate for Kentucky. So I'm not saying that we would support a resolution to that effect, but just that we acknowledge that there is an issue and we ask the legislature to investigate it. Is there any objection to me writing a letter of that nature? Mr. Likens.
Judge, I'd like to find out, and maybe someone can elaborate on this. I'm under the impression this may be against federal law, that and this would be a state law, that we would still be violating federal law.
You can answer, please.
Thank you, Councilman, for that statement. It is a valid concern, very valid. Right now, we have 29 states that have done medical cannabis laws. They have not run into federal issues with the particular state. Now, there have been individuals, there have been some business owners that were not compliant with the state laws that have run into issues with the federal government. But there has been no federal intervention in any state that has regulated medical cannabis.
I have a question. Sir, you keep saying 29, 33 states. I only know of Colorado, and I think California just did something. I don't know all these
I
other
can go
states.
through this. Yes, sir.
I mean, because this whole thing is so confusing because
Right.
I think people say hemp oil works for the same thing as cannabis oil. I mean, I'm not ready to vote on anything because I don't have enough information to vote on it. I'm not going to vote on something I don't know anything about.
I
so.
completely understand that, and I value your opinion. Why there is a difference in counts medically, for medical purposes, there are 29 states that have a working program. Mr. Stein counted 30. There is Mississippi that has a medical cannabis program, but the way that they implemented it, the agriculture department in Mississippi had to dispense. That can't be done according to the federal government, so that program hasn't functioned. Now, you mentioned Colorado and California. Those states have legal cannabis. So that means for anybody over 21. There are actually 10 states now that have legal marijuana. And now I can also touch on CBD or hemp that you were talking about. In Kentucky in 2014, we passed Senate Bill 50, which allowed the production of hemp products. That went hand in hand with the federal farming law that allowed states to have pilot hemp programs. Well, in that program, we allowed the production of hemp for CBD oil purposes. So we grow those hemp plants. They're the same as cannabis plants. They just have a lower amount of THC. So THC being that component that causes the euphoria, but also pain relief. So that's why, we have that conflicting, federal guidance on what marijuana is and what hemp is. It's all technicality. It's the same plant. Under federal definition, hemp is anything under 0.3% THC, but it's only the stalk and the center section of the plant. It's not the flowers. So then we legalize something that's actually still illegal federally also. So we have a hemp program that may potentially still be, it's still federally illegal, but we have it here in Kentucky already. See, so that goes into hand in hand what he was saying about the illegality. It's all the same plant.
I'm just confused because I always told that hemp and marijuana plants are totally different. And somebody told me that you can't cross-pollinate it, but then somebody says, I've heard on WHS they will not cross-pollinate. So I don't know.
I'd be happy to bring you books on it. I've read a lot. It's the only difference in hemp and cannabis is by definition of the federal government. It's the same plant. It's the cannabis plant from the genus cannabis. The definition is hemp is anything under 0.3% THC. It's like an alcoholic beer and a non-alcoholic beer. What's the difference? They're both beers. Anything under that certain level of alcohol becomes a non-alcoholic beer.
Question, if the hemp oil will work for MS and work for glaucoma and work for seizures, why do you need the other then?
That's a very
You're
good
saying
point.
it's the same thing? There's just so much controversy about this.
Right.
I can't. put
For
my
some
name on it.
patients, the hemp oil is enough. There's some pediatric patients with autism, epilepsy that are getting medical benefits from it. But there are also some pediatric patients that are not getting the benefit from it. Now, one thing that's important to note with the hemp legality here in Kentucky, patients using these legal hemp products are testing positive for marijuana. They're not testing positive for hemp. So we have people here in Kentucky, citizens, normal citizens, not approved by physicians, who are going to a legal store, purchasing a legal product, consuming that legal product, and therefore testing positive for an illegal product. And they're running into issues with parent custody time, medications. They're testing positive for an illegal product. So it's, you know, it's a catch-22. I understand your concerns, and we're trying to cover the, you know, not just your concerns, everybody else's.
My opinion is that once if the state approves it, then it'll come back to us anyway, and we'll have to decide what we're gonna do to it. So that would be my decision.
You have to decide, yes, on the sales. The consumption or possession for a patient would be legal as long as that they would get a recommendation, but the sale of it in your community would not. That would be up to this body here later on.
Judge,
Magistrate Likens.
before I would vote for or against this House Bill 166, I would like for us to get some information on the contrasting views against this, because I'm like Magistrate Logston, I don't know enough about it, and all I've heard is people telling me why we should, and I'd like to hear from a few people who tell us why we shouldn't.
And I understand your concerns there, if I may touch on it for just a second. We've tried to bring both pros and con views to Frankfurt. We have another one-pager that I could provide here in a later time that has the cons. To touch on that, in states that have regulated cannabis, they have seen a slight increase in traffic accidents. They have seen a decrease in traffic fatalities. They have seen an increase in calls to poison control for cannabis consumption. There have been a lot of people that have, they weren't aware of what cannabis would do to their body, so they were scared once they consumed it that first time. Again, that's not for medical, that is for recreational consumption. That's not what we're working on here. There are instances where some states have seen an uptick in teen use. So that has gone up a small amount, 2 to 3%. And, you know, while that is statistically, you know, we don't know if that's from availability or if it's because the state has regulated it and they therefore feel more comfortable in answering those questions. But overall, teen use has gone down. You know, and obviously, my view is going to be seen as pro because I am a patient and I am here. But we are trying to bring in the pros and the cons, and I'd be happy to give you that one pager here at a later time. I believe I have your email, and I'll send it to you here.
How difficult is it going to be to keep the medical from creeping over into the recreational use?
Well, and that's a
what
very
I'm
good
concerned
question
with
too.
More than anything is how do we keep a lid on this?
And that's actually, we were in committee 3 different times last week in front of the Judiciary Committee, and that was one of the questions that they kept bringing up. How do we keep this from going to recreational? How do we, you know, we're not letting everybody have it. So their opinion was, well, we're going to limit the conditions even more. So it's not just, you know, you're not just getting it for a stub toe. You're not just getting it, you know, because you're moody. You're getting it for a valid condition. And you're getting it once approved by a physician, and then also having that second approval through the state. So we are trying to limit it before, you know, we don't want it to get to everyone.
Well, we kind of all saw what happened to the opioid epidemic when doctors are just writing prescriptions left and right and, you know, writing the same person 20 prescriptions for the same thing.
And I understand that too. See, I worked in the early 2000s in an emergency room in Louisville, one of the busiest emergency rooms, for about 8 years. During that whole time there, I saw many deaths from opioids, saw many deaths from car accidents, cardiopulmonary arrests, but never saw one there because of marijuana. There has never been an overdose attributed to marijuana, and the FDA actually has data showing that there has never been a death attributed to cannabis. They compared cannabis to 17 other pharmaceutical FDA-approved drugs. Those 17 drugs caused over 10,000 deaths. Cannabis had 0 primary deaths. They attributed nearly 200 for secondary deaths. So what they've seen is in some people it could potentially cause a cardiac, an arrhythmia. You know, and that may cause a heart attack or a stroke potentially later on down the road, but there is no physical it is not the cause of death in anyone, is what they've seen.
Magistrate Dye.
Thank you, Judge. Your last comment about being, that wasn't my question, but that last comment saying that no deaths have been attributed directly to cannabis, that's kind of like telling me somebody died from a gunshot when they didn't directly attribute it to gunpowder. Okay? I think that's a non-starting statement. But to go back to what Magistrate Likens just said, you said that you know that there's going to be money for the law enforcement and all that. Well, I've been on the court long enough to know that any time that we hear stuff like, oh, you're going to get money for this, you're going to get money for that, people up here on this court, we make the decision to do things, and we get promised all this money from these other entities, and we don't ever quite see exactly what happens and what we're told, and because we're on the end that we're the ones that has all the expenses.
Yep.
And we got to pay for the police. We
Right.
got to pay for the EMS. We got to pay for the coroner. And my part is, the state, in my mind, unfortunately, doesn't do a real good job of controlling their drugs. We've had the pill mills, now we've got the opium problem, the opioid problem. Is this just the next, in other words, in 2 or 3 years, if this, and I'm not saying not a good thing, okay? I'm not saying that at all. But in 2 or 3 years, are we going to be sitting at the same table saying, well, the opioids got fixed, now we got a medical marijuana problem?
Right.
Because they're scamming, they're gaming the system.
Well,
And it's not you or your people or your group that's controlling that. It's the people in Frankfurt saying, oh, yeah, we've got this cabinet for safety and we're going to do all these things. Right now, they got 2 strikes against them.
I understand your fears and concerns.
I mean, we got the chief of police sitting back there, and he's been on the job a long time. They just, it's just sometimes things are a little too good to be true.
Well, in the early 2000s, when I worked in the emergency room, there was no accountability for opioid prescribing patterns of physicians. And we have patients that would go to a dentist, they'd go to their primary care physician, they'd go to 2 different emergency rooms, and then they go to their pain management doctor and get a prescription for opioids at each one of those physicians, right? After that, I believe it was in 2013, they passed CASPR. And CASPR limited that because they had accountability. They kept up with physicians who were prescribing, patients who were prescribing, where they got those prescriptions. And we're asking for all of that tight oversight before we even have a program, so that we cut that out before we even start. There's accountability for which patients, which doctors, where they buy it, how much they buy, accountability of where it's being sold. And all of this comes out at the very end of each year in a report that's given to not just the legislative members, but also a 19-member oversight committee, which is made up of legislative members, members of city, doctors, patients. There's many different representatives in this board. And they keep up with, again, how many patients there are and how many physicians are prescribing, how many patients each one of those physicians have, just to make sure we don't have, the same issue that we had with the pill mills, in various counties where we had a trailer of patients lined up and just paying cash.
Right. Well, I just came back from Magistrate's Training Conference. Some of us were there, and there was a gentleman there talking about opioid problem, and jump in, anybody that was there. If I got these figures wrong, you were sitting right beside me, Chris, so you be my mind here. But I think it was West Virginia. They had prescribed 11 million doses. Was that right?
Yeah, something like that.
11 million doses in this one county in West Virginia.
You're right.
Like 171 hits of opium for every person in the county every day.
Right.
And they went back and they said, well, all that information's on this master list kept by the DEA. And then they said, well, there was 2 reports filed that year for suspicious prescription. Since this opioid thing and the lawsuits are coming out of the wall now and everything, now in the last year they had 8,000 suspected bogus or suspected buys.
Right.
So I hear what you're saying, but are we going to have to go through that big learning curve? I mean, it seemed like to me The DEA should have got it after the pill mills. They should have figured out with Oxycontin and all that. They should have figured it out. You know, these guys are getting, all we did was just trade one drug for another. And these are all coming from doctors that are supposed to be, and I'm not knocking the doctors, but there's a group of them out there that are not playing square, and so we're gonna be right back in the same boat again. And I want to see anybody that needs help get help. Don't get me wrong, but I think we got to control the controllers.
I agree with you, and it's all about accountability and holding those responsible.
It's not the pro and con of the product. I'm not going to doubt what you're telling us is true, because I have no reason to doubt you. But I do know from history what these watchers are not watching. Okay.
Magistrate
Thank you.
Eldridge.
Thank you, Judge. Again, I want to thank Mr. Montalvo for coming out today. I know you, Judge, as well as I, went to the forum in Jefferson County. We went to the forum in Oldham County, and in Mr. Montalvo's few moments here today, he's made more clear points than I heard at either of the other forums.
Thank you.
Really appreciate you coming, and I would love to see a situation where you and Ms. Burrows could get together and look at both sides of this argument and give us a good presentation.
Yeah, I
But
would
I think
love
any
to.
decision today is premature. I just don't think we have enough. I still have questions and would love to get your email to talk to you about, you know, when you're in an accident, not inebriated in any way. But when they test you, is your insurance company come back and say, hey, he had too much marijuana? Just, in other words, there's an exact formula for the alcohol where they'd say, you know, if you had an accident, 9 o'clock the next morning, you had .01, well, you had a beer last night, that's okay. It couldn't have affected you. And that worries me, and I'd like to have that discussion with you. But I would just love to see some sort of format where Liz Burrows and Mr. Montalvo could get together and show us both sides of this. As you can see, he's very well spoken, and so is Liz. Let's get that done.
All right, I think you appreciate you staying here. Didn't want to let you sit here to the end of the meeting to have this discussion. We're obviously not physicians sitting here. We're not medically educated for the most part. We're trying to do the right thing. It is true that all of us will get up and walk off the stage or out of the room. Unlikely any of us are going to have a seizure here today, or none of us are autistic. One of us does have MS. I think we're all sympathetic to the pain that's out there and certainly don't want to deny appropriate treatment to people, but we don't want to jump into something wrong either. We don't. So I appreciate the support you've gotten from other communities. Work with the legislature. We're happy to have another presentation here to learn more, but at this time, we're not sure of our footing, sure enough of our footing to step forward. But that being said, I have a sister-in-law that's in a wheelchair, full of pain. I know people who are hurting, and I want to help them if I can, but don't want to trigger another problem either.
I understand that. Thank you, council members, for your time, your attention, and your comments. They've been very productive. And I look forward to, you know, continuing this discussion at a later time. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very
sir.
much. All
Thank
right.
you.
Been asked to ask for a 5-minute break. Court amenable to that? All right. Stake 5, please.